From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Here's what's ahead. K-State's Terry Griffin and Gregg Ibendhal continue their series on the factors that lead to top-performing farms economically in Kansas. They recently analyzed the influence of farm size and debt management on farm profitability, and they'll talk about what they've discovered. Also today, K-State's Keith Harmoney will talk about pasture grass recovery after wildfire. He was one of the speakers at the Starbuck Fire Grass and Rangeland Recovery Tour held in the Ashland area earlier this week. Keith will tell what he's observed in the aftermath of the western Kansas wildfires of 2 years ago. And later on, with Stop, Look, and Listen, K-State's Gus Vanderhoeven, right here on Agriculture Today. Agricultural producers, landowners, and creditors, you have a partner in your legal and financial needs. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services offers reliable, trusted information and guidance. Whether you need advice for ag credit concerns or are transitioning your operation to the next owner, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services can assist you in making sound decisions for your business. To learn more, call 800-321-3276 or visit us online. You're listening to Agriculture Today. Glad to have you tuned in. And for you now, the next installment in what will be an ongoing series of discussions about top farms, economically speaking, in Kansas, and what makes for those high-performing farms in the economic sense. This is something that our two guests are working on rather constantly now. Terry Griffin and Gregg Ibendhal are agricultural economists with K-State Research and Extension, and they've just released their latest information regarding those things that drive economics on the better-performing farms in Kansas. To recap how the two of you identify top farms, Gregg, would you please refresh us on that?
Yeah, sure. So what we did was we basically every year we looked at a 10-year set of data, and every year in that 10-year we went through and ranked the farms in order of profitability from one to, I think we had to have a couple hundred farms in there, from one to the bottom like that every year, and then we averaged those rankings over 10 years. And then basically that we said those were the top farms. So if you were consistently in the top year after year, then you had a pretty low average ranking and you were considered to be one of our top farms and vice versa. And one of the things we found out from that was there is a definite difference between the top and bottom farms. There's the kind of the distribution is kind of a normal distribution. So we kind of have a small number of farms at the very top. We have a whole bunch of farms that are kind of in the middle section. And then we kind of have fewer farms in the bottom side.
We talked about that general overview last time, reminding that this is based on Kansas Farm Management Association data. We need to stress that, Gregg.
Yes, it's very important. Yeah, so we probably have a certain characteristics of those. We probably have a certain range of farms that would want to use our services, so we don't have any of the really small farms or any of the really big farms you would see out in western Kansas either.
Now, the last time the two of you were here, Terry, we left off with the idea that, yes, there is this distinction between farms and their performance across Kansas, across regions, but we were still striving to find out what are the difference makers there. And you and Gregg have come up with a couple of angles, right?
We did. So the second article in the series, we evaluated farm size, the number of acres in farms, and that was really interesting. The results were fascinating because we found that there was no statistical difference in acreage relative to the rankings, the average rankings of the farms, which implies that as farms got bigger, it did not impact their ability to move up or down in profitability rankings. And we posted these results already on Ag Manager, and when we did that, we announced this on social media and got quite a bit of feedback. There was a lot of people on social media who were arguing the point that they hear that if you're not getting bigger, then you're losing out. And
that's been a theme that's been around for
we've been hearing that for decades.
Long while.
Right? And there is some truth to that, but it's not always universally true either. And that kind of leads us into our third analysis of this series, which looks into farm debt-to-asset ratios, which we did find a significant difference in farm profitability rankings.
Let's get into that in just a second, but staying with the farm size question for a moment. Gregg, this general statement that comes out that farm size really isn't that much of a difference maker, that is consistent across all regions of Kansas?
Yeah, basically we didn't find any difference, the range of farm sizes that we had. We don't really see any advantage to being bigger in farm size. And as Terry mentioned, that goes against what a lot of our colleagues in other departments across the U.S. would say, and conventional wisdom, that you kind of have to be bigger to be efficient. We're just not seeing that.
It's quite an interesting revelation. Go ahead.
Keep in mind, too, our KFMA database, we sorted it to where the farms we evaluated were in the database every year for the last 10 years. So these aren't brand new farms. These aren't farms that have slipped in and out of KFMA. These are farms that have been consistently farming and members of KFMA for the last decade. So we've already biased the sample somewhat of very stable, successful farms. So we need the listeners to keep that in mind.
But that does not change the message.
No, message is the same.
Once more, the size of farm, not a limiting factor. So you look to the next variable, which was farm debt. And you actually used a specific measurement of debt in your analysis here, Gregg, right?
Yeah, just like, so we didn't want to use net farm income in the original ranking of the farms because obviously bigger farms would tend to bias the sample. So we had to put net farm income on a per acre basis when we did the original rankings. So we could have done something similar like that with the debt. We could have actually calculated a debt per acre, but there's already a ratio like that measures debt on a relative percent basis, the debt to asset ratio. So it just seemed kind of natural to use that as our measure of the debt level on a farm.
Well, what did you find out when you tied that into profitability of the farm? Is there a relationship there, and is there any variability there?
Well, for this factor, we did see a significant result with the debt to asset ratio, with the fact that if you have a higher debt to asset ratio, that tends to pull down your ranking, and you would actually have you wouldn't be a top farm anymore. So it's not a tremendous slope to there, but that is a significant factor, at least in two of the regions, at least in the east and central part of Kansas. In the western part of Kansas, it wasn't quite significant, but it was pretty close. So we normally use like a 0.05 measure of being significant. It was like 0.07, so it wasn't too far from being significant actually in the western part either.
So it's a difference maker, it sounds, the debt level.
Yeah, I would say so. And what's a little bit surprising, too, is, right now debt levels the debt interest rates are pretty low right now. So if you're just looking at thinking, well, is debt going to be important? Even the fact that we're paying probably low amounts of interest, our interest rates are low, it's still a significant factor.
Now, it's worth pointing out as well in your write-up on this particular principle that the percentage of Farm Management Association farms you measured, they're in pretty good standing with their debt-to-asset ratios, are they not?
So keep in mind, these farms have been in operation for at least 10 years. Right? So they're already successful. There's a lot of farms that we evaluated that had a zero debt-to-asset ratio, which means they essentially have no debt. Even if you look at that, there's a pretty wide variability on how those ranked with respect to profitability. So, it doesn't necessarily say that if you have no debt that you're going to have high profit. That wasn't part of this results. But we did see that as debt to asset increased, as more debt was taken on relative to the assets, that typically the rankings were not as good with respect to profitability.
That debt-to-asset ratio thing you see reported in the media, a lot of times they report, well, the average farm in the U.S. has a debt-to-asset ratio maybe in the high teens or low 20s, which makes you think all the farms in the U.S. are doing really well. But really, there's quite a wide range of distribution for farms with a debt-to-asset ratio. It's not every farm has that really nice low debt-to-asset ratio. And in fact, a lot of the literature you see out there in the farm management side of things says that you strive to have a farm that has a debt-to-asset ratio under like 30% would typically be the top of the good range. Well, if you look at our data, we have about 70% of our farms that would actually have a debt-to-asset ratio below 0.3 or 30%, and we have that, which means then we have 30% of our farms that would have a debt-to-asset ratio higher than that. We'll normally consider that to be kind of the yellow range or the red range as far as debt-to-asset ratio is concerned. So really, there's a very wide distribution out there among our debt levels of our farms.
Well, this seems to be saying rather clearly that there is a high importance associated with debt management in terms of maintaining and accelerating one's profitability.
Sure. So debt is not necessarily bad on its own. It's how people manage that debt with the farm business. And those who can control it will be relatively better off than those who are unable to control farm debt.
Now, we talked about farm size and whether or not it makes a difference. Taking on more debt in the purpose of expanding one's operation. What do these two sets of data say about that?
Well, I think this makes a nice set of papers together because I know a lot of farmers have reasons they want to get bigger, and I'm sure a lot of them are perfectly justified. But I think farmers need to be careful. I mean, just getting bigger to get bigger, I think you need to weigh that with what's that extra debt going to do to your farm load and where you can meet the interest payments and how it's going to affect profitability. So my message would be don't get bigger just to get bigger. Make sure you weigh that against what it's actually going to cost you with adding more debt to your farm.
One of the discussions on Twitter this week about this particular study was how some farms were large and carried a substantial amount of debt, and they decided to cut back on acreage, and they got rid of a lot of debt in doing so, and now they're operating debt-free as a smaller farm, but overall I think they felt like their profitability was better, but more importantly, the stress levels were reduced.
Yeah, and one thing going forward, too, so, right now we're kind of at a period where, interest rates are still pretty low here. Yeah. My concern going forward is what happens as interest rates start to rise. I think those farms that do have a lot of debt, I think they're going to see a lot more hurt from that than what a farmer that doesn't have any debt at all is going to see.
Well, this series is proving revealing in regard to what makes for a top-performing farm economically in the state of Kansas. The two of you are not done. You have other variables you want to examine?
There's a lot. I was going to tell the listeners, if you got any ideas or suggestions, you can contact us and make those suggestions. We've already gotten a few from Twitter. Email us at the university or contact us on social media on Twitter through Ag Manager. I'm open, Gregg.
Yeah, I have about 12 variables in my initial idea for that we're doing this. Things like looking at your crop mix, your percent of rented acres, farmer's age, working capital things, and things like that. But there's other data variables in our KFMA database, too, that I could potentially use. So, yeah, as Terry said, if anybody has any suggestions, we'd be glad to entertain those.
Excellent. Looking forward to your next entry in this series. We'll have you back here relatively soon to talk over what more you've uncovered in this.
Thanks, Eric. We appreciate meeting with you.
Agricultural economists Terry Griffin and Gregg Ibendhal, K-State Research and Extension, with us. If you'd like to catch up on their entire series to date on the makeup of top-performing farms in Kansas in the economic sense, you can go to agmanager.info and read up on all of this at agmanager.info. We'll be back with more in a moment on this Agriculture Today.
Agriculture and food systems are the main drivers of the Kansas economy, but must be improved in order to feed the world's growing population. How are we going to do so? Reduce food loss, find ways to preserve grasslands, and help families stretch their dollars. Global food systems is one of the 5 grand challenges K-State Research and Extension is addressing. To learn more, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
You're listening to Agriculture Today. Well, it has been 2 years since the epic and extraordinarily destructive wildfires that swept over western Kansas, the most noteworthy of which the Starbuck fire that devastated thousands of acres of grassland in Clark, Comanche, Meade, and Ford counties, and not to mention the massive loss of livestock and property. Well, the scorched pastures have now had a couple of years to recover, and this past Monday, K-State Research and Extension hosted a Starbuck Fire Grass and Rangeland Recovery Tour of the area around Ashland. Among those addressing the attendees there, longtime range scientist Keith Harmoney from K-State's Agricultural Research Center at Hays. To note, the Hays-Ellis County area was also hit with substantial wildfire damage back in March of 2017. Keith was asked for his observations on grassland response to wildfire. And prior to his presentation, he sat down and visited about that with the K-State Radio Network's Pat Melgaris.
Throughout western Kansas, there were several wildfires that occurred in 1 week's time, March 6th through 10th, back in 2017. And, of course, the one down here at Ashland, or near Ashland, well, basically went through Clark County, was the largest of those fires. But there were several others throughout the state as well, and some of those occurred closer to where my research center's up at Hayes.
Right.
We had a couple fires in Ellis County and also in Russell County. And so I'm going to be talking today about some of the things that I saw looking at the rangeland closer to home up there in Ellis County and Russell County, what we saw in the recovery, and then trying to relate it to what folks probably have seen down here from the Starbuck fire as well.
So break that down. When these very damaging fires come through, talk a little bit about what was seen and the issues at that time.
Well, after a fire that occurs outside of the growing season, one of the main things that you want to have happen quickly is you want to have soil cover occur. One of the things that can be most damaging when you denude the soil of any vegetation, because it opens it up for water erosion, opens it up for wind erosion. Soil cover is one of the main things that you want to occur quickly. And so one of the things that we were able to see up in Ellis County was that we had some pretty timely rainfall soon after the fire. And so we had soil moisture so that those plants, when they had good growing conditions for warmth then from the spring temperatures rising, we were able to get growth to establish pretty quickly and get some ground cover. So that's one of the main things that you need after a fire, is that you want to have that soil cover occur. And that's what we do with prescribed burning, is we usually do it at a time of year when we're under soil conditions where we have moist soil, so that we get rapid growth of those plants right away. And so that's one of the things that we look for is getting that quick growth and then looking at the cover throughout the year.
So how bad was the damage that you were seeing within the past year and even 2 years ago?
Well, most of the damage that occurred was basically to things that weren't natural, things that we put in the system, like fencing, buildings, those sorts of things. Our rangelands evolved with fire, so they're adapted to being able to recover. Just usually we like to have those burns occur under more managed conditions than what occurred during those fires in March of 2017. But up in our rangelands that we monitored up in Ellis County, we had what I would call excellent recovery. We had the soil moisture from timely rains, and we had vegetation come back well. We lost litter cover, of course, from that occurs after a fire goes through. You lose some of that litter covering of the soil from that old growth and vegetation that, basically it's not alive anymore, but it falls to the soil surface and forms litter. We lose some of that during fires, and that has taken a little bit of time to develop again. But as far as vegetative cover and getting litter cover back, we've been able to see improvements over the last 2 years.
Mm-hmm. Again, our rangelands have evolved with fire. So really it's a good thing, but preferably that would be more in a controlled fashion.
Yeah, when we do prescribed burning, we do it under conditions that are, I guess, more manageable for us to control the fire, and where it's going to know more of how it's going to behave. So
again, just kind of reiterate what your message today at noon is going to be to the producers here.
Well, I'm going to be showing the folks at noon today that even though we did have wildfire occur that was basically unmanageable, that our vegetation is very resilient, and under good growing conditions and management, that it's able to recover over time, and it's actually adapted to fires occurring.
Then, in his presentation, Keith talked about the capacity of pasture grass to recover from wildfire, based on what he's seen following the fires in the Ellis County area back in 17, and making comparisons with historical research.
There's data from our research center that shows that back in the 50s, we had a fire at the research center as well. And that fire drastically reduced production for up to 3 years after the fire. Whereas in this here, we had production
that was equal to the average just 2 years after. And part of that's, I think, the conditions that occurred, that we were able to get good timely rains that year of the fire, that we were able to get some good vigorous plant growth that very first year initially.
Now, in the question and answer session, one producer asked if the state of the grass prior to the wildfire made any difference in the recovery. In other words, would overgrazing or undergrazing have played a role?
Well, I would say that any time that you have a pasture, a rangeland that's under stress from being grazed more heavily, having more utilization over a period of years, that anytime you induce another stress on top of it, like from a wildfire during a dormant season, you would probably expect to have more damage occur, more plant crowns that would probably be damaged, because they would probably be lower in vigor to start with.
Longer recovery time.
And longer recovery time, yep. I would expect that.
Another asked about cattle gains on pasture following a wildfire compared to the typical gains in the years before the fire. Keith addressed that and then talked about keeping an eye on the grass species composition in the years following wildfire, citing his research experience with that.
Our gains were actually fairly similar. You know, you get year-to-year variation anyway because of precipitation occurring at different times of the year. Sometimes it occurs in a more timely manner than others, but our cow and calf weights, I think, for that year, I think they were about 15 pounds lower than the prior 2 years before.
Yeah.
But we took them out on those pastures later too. So we didn't have the early grazing on those pastures that we had had the couple years before. So basically, after a fire, what you want to manage for is you want to manage for soil cover and plant vigor, because that plant vigor, that plant is going to be what's producing vegetative or cover over the soil. You want to have vigorous plants so they can grow as well as possible, produce as much dry matter as possible. So one, that it covers the soil just aerially, but also when that dry matter weathers and decays, it covers the soil and becomes litter. Okay, so want to manage for soil cover and plant vigor. And look for shifts in composition. That's what we're doing with our monitoring over time, is we're looking for shifts in composition. What plants are growing in population and which ones were reduced in population. And for many of our rangelands, you see an increase in western wheat, side oats, Indian grass, little and big blue stem, and sand blue stem. Those are usually shifts in the proper direction. If you see an increase in buffalo grass or a big increase in blue grama, that's usually a decline in your rangeland over time. So we want to see more of our mid and tall grasses. Those are the ones that are most productive. So those are what to be looking for.
That's K-State rangeland scientist Keith Harmoney talking with pasture managers about the longer-term impacts of wildfire on grassland. He was one of the speakers at the Starbuck Fire, Grass, and Rangeland Recovery Tour in the Ashland area this past Monday, co-sponsored by K-State Research and Extension. Thanks again to the K-State Radio Network's Pat Malgaris for gathering that sound from the tour. And you're tuned to Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
This is the K-State Radio Network, and you're listening to Agriculture Today. Welcome back. Eric Atkinson here. Today's agricultural news headlines coming your way now, courtesy in part of DTN. More than 1 million private wells that supply drinking water in rural parts of the Midwest could face the risk of contamination from floodwater, posing a health concern that could linger long after the flooding subsides. The major flooding along the Missouri and Mississippi rivers and several of the smaller waterways has inundated states in the middle of the country, from the Canadian border as far south as Kentucky. Contaminated water can carry bacteria such as E. coli that can cause gastrointestinal illness, reproductive problems, and neurological disorders. That, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The National Groundwater Association, a trade group for the industry that includes well systems, said that there are 1.1 million private wells in 300 flooded counties in 10 states, including Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa, and Missouri. Now, well owners who see floodwater near or over their wells should assume that the drinking water supply is contaminated, according to that organization, and should watch for any change in the color, smell, or taste of the water, and should consider at that point alternatives such as bottled water. Once the flooding recedes, remaining well water should be pumped out and the well should be disinfected, according to Chuck Jobe, who's the Regulatory Affairs Manager for the National Groundwater Association. Once the well is disinfected, says Jobe, water should be tested to make sure that it is safe. Meantime, the USDA is opening 2 more emergency programs for flood-stricken producers in Nebraska. Here's more from the USDA's Gary Crawford.
More help for flood-stricken farms and farmers in Nebraska. USDA announcing it will allow emergency grazing of animals on conservation reserve acres in every Nebraska county until April 30th. But producers and landowners need to work with their local farm service agency office before moving animals. Also, 45 counties in Nebraska authorized now for the Emergency Conservation Program. Bobby Chris Wickham with the state FSA office told us
the Emergency Conservation Program can provide some cost share assistance to rehabilitate farmland and also help maybe restore fences.
And remove debris and regrade the land if needed. However, some caution to farmers who are very anxious to start work on that land.
Producers need to contact their county office first before they do any of those types of repairs if they think they're going to want to use that emergency conservation program.
Local Farm Service agency people need to assess whether or not they should go and do an on-site inspection of the land before authorizing a producer to use the emergency conservation program. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Washington.
The White House and business groups are stepping up efforts to win congressional approval for the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade accord. The prospects, though uncertain, given that Republicans are at odds with some aspects of the plan and Democrats are in no hurry to secure a political victory for the president. President Trump met with GOP lawmakers yesterday to try to kickstart the process for rounding up the votes on Capitol Hill. Supporters in Congress and business groups say they have a narrow window to push it through, given that lawmakers tend to avoid the tougher trade votes during an election season. Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa, the Republican chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, maintains that the president should lift the steel and aluminum tariffs on products brought in from Canada and Mexico as a first step to getting that trade agreement through Congress. Trump's top trade negotiator, Robert Lighthizer, told lawmakers during a recent congressional hearing that if they don't pass the trade agreement, the U.S. will, in his words, have no credibility at all with future trading partners, including China. The White House Legislative Affairs team has talked to more than 290 members of Congress and staff over the past 2 months to push the deal. However, the administration knows that making changes in the agreement to win over lawmakers could jeopardize the support for the pact from Canada and Mexico. Well, spring means burning season in the Flint Hills of Kansas. And Todd Domer reminds us here that ranchers and landowners have online tools available to help prevent smoke from becoming a problem in populated areas.
The prescribed burning season is underway, with ranchers and landowners using the practice to improve grazing distribution and decrease undesirable vegetation. In order to balance the use of prescribed fire in the Flint Hills with the need for clean air in downwind communities, those planning to burn should consider the voluntary smoke management plan. Through its voluntary approach, the plan leaves flexibility in the hands of the land manager, but puts the responsibility on him or her to make wise decisions. Resources available at ksfire.org will help ranchers prevent problematic smoke events in highly populated areas by giving them access to powerful online tools. A map shows the potential smoke impact of burning in a specific area on urban air quality. The smoke modeling tool allows someone to see where smoke will go from a fire in a specific location. Last year, more than 1 million acres were burned in 17 Kansas counties making up the Flint Hills, down from 2.2 million acres in 2017. Drought conditions and less than ideal weather for prescribed burning last year led to the fewest number of Flint Hills acres burned since 2013. As the new spring burning season begins, the Kansas Department of Health and Environment reported only a few more than 22,000 acres were burned in Kansas from March 15th through the 18th. I'm Todd Domer.
And lastly, in today's headlines, the Senate yesterday voted 57-0 against the non-binding Green New Deal resolution, all Republicans voting against it. 3 Democrats and 1 independent also voted against the measure. But the remaining Democrats voted present, protesting what they said was a political stunt by Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who pushed the vote on the non-binding resolution. Those voting present included the author of the resolution and others who have expressed their support for the plan. Now, Senate Ag Committee Chairman Pat Roberts of Kansas was among the Republicans expressing dismay at the resolution. In remarks on the Senate floor, he touted the fact that farmers are the original environmentalists and are adapters of the new technology. Quoting Senator Roberts, "Show me a farmer who does not practice conservation or does not have access to the very latest technology, and I will show you a farmer in trouble." Roberts said he could understand where those drawing up the Green New Deal were coming from, but he called on them to, quoting again, catch up with the agriculture community and with farm country. Well, another option for taking in our broadcast is to catch up on our podcast version of Agriculture Today. To do so, go to agtoday.net. You'll find the program there, and to tap the subscribe button, you'll find brand new episodes of the program automatically arriving on your device every weekday. The starting point is agtoday.net. This is the K-State Radio Network.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
This is Agriculture Today. Stop, look, and listen.
Adding a water feature to the home landscape adds interest.
That's Gus Vanderhoeven of Kansas State University with comment on life in rural Kansas.
A dear friend called and asked for some advice on how to make her small fountain, actually a water feature, blend in better. She had pulled out the shrubs which had stood behind it. They were getting too big. But now what? Adding a water feature to the home landscape adds more interest. It's one of the needs for butterflies. Her yard being filled with flowering plants does attract butterflies. But with water and a sunning rock close by, you can take a close look at the butterfly as it lands for a drink on the edge of the fountain. And then there is the sound, the gently gurgling on a summer evening. There are many different ways to go with water. A small pond either dug in or a half whiskey barrel set among plants. If you're lucky, there may be a stream running through your garden, a small stream which does not flood. You can even think a small marsh and select those plants which will grow in wet soil. Many ways to go. But my friend's challenge was a 3 feet plus columnar fountain where the water would circulate from top to bottom over small sculpted dishes. It stood on a 16-inch by 16-inch footing. To be able to give advice and think creatively, I swung by the house and stepped in their backyard. The fountain stands next to the patio on an area roughly 6 feet by 6 feet. That's not very big, with the back of the house as a backdrop. Not very interesting. Beyond the 6 by 6 area were some small shrubs, and then the walk leading to the patio with pergola. I hope you get a picture of the setting. Of course, to help with the design, you have to go and look or have very good photographs which help you get the feel for the area. The fountain and its function are the key elements, so that aspect should not be overshadowed with plant material. Don't laugh. That can easily be done. Remember, they pulled the plants out. I wanted to separate the fountain from the wall, but on a small corner of the garden, that is not easily done. I'm looking for narrow, upright evergreens to place in a gentle curve behind the fountain. They have to stay small, up to 5 feet, but no more. The fountain is only 3 feet tall. You have to understand and feel scale here. I've looked at upright yews. What I like about yew is that it can be pruned or shaped, and then you can control its size. Yes, now you have to prune. That can become a chore, or is just a garden task to be enjoyed. It's not a big hedge, just 3 or 4 plants, maybe 5. Remember, yew clippings are poisonous, so don't throw the clippings to the goats, and that is no joke. There are dwarf evergreens, but I also must think budget. I'm leaning towards the backdrop of the evergreens as a quiet, strong backdrop setting the fountain off. You could even raise the fountain slightly, say 6-8 inches, so that flowers planted at its base will not cover it. A small footing or cement blocks painted an earth tone could do that trick, and it could hide some of the equipment which makes the fountain work. Then I thought ornamental grass. Again, several plants in a slight curve placed behind the fountain in front of the wall. There are several grasses to choose from. You do want an upright grass, that is purple millet, Fuster grass, or maiden grass, and more. They show form, texture, and color. Carefully done, it can help set off the fountain. The limited space keeps the constraints in place. When I thought about the limited space, I came up with the idea of using a heavy panel, a wire panel. I looked behind my shed where I saved that kind of stuff for exactly this kind of challenge. I don't need a whole panel. 6 feet by 5 feet high would do it. Setting the heavy wire in a gentle curve again behind the fountain would provide support for a climbing vine, honeysuckle, flowering peas, or your choice. That arrangement could be changed with different plantings each year. Another idea, there are other shrubs like red-leaf barberry, which one can keep pruned into a small hedge. But that, to me, is growing and getting too wild. The space in front and along the sides will be planted with colorful annuals and perennials of different form, color, and texture. Remember, we have the round form peonies, the horizontal yarrow, and the upright gladioli, for example. Here again, you have to use your imagination, but the key here is and remains the fountain. There is one heavy flat stone, a sandstone, laying in front. It holds memories of a friend. That stone is special. Depending on what my friend chooses as being the design solution she likes, I'm going to look for another small boulder I can handle with the dolly to place in that small area. It could make a good rock for butterflies to land on and dry their delicate wings. Just one other rock. No rock garden. As a last thought, off to the side, a small weeping, blooming tree might make that corner very special. The trouble is, they don't come cheap, and we have budgets. But it doesn't have all to be done this year. Even though it is spring and the daffodils are up and tulips are showing leaves, start with the basic improvements and add to it next year. This fall, plant several of the bulbs and be surprised next spring. Now, get busy and do something in the yard.
Gus Vander Hoeven of Kansas State University with his weekly commentary on life in rural Kansas. And with that, our Wednesday edition comes to a close. As always, thanks to you for being along with us. We'll be back this same time tomorrow. Hope you will as well. Meantime, Eric Atkinson bidding you a good day for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.